Hey guys, welcome to episode 3 of the podcast. This episode's titled Maidstone's Most Important Poet, and it doesn't refer to myself as some of you may have thought, seeing as I'm from Maidstone originally and, as you know, I'm somebody who writes poetry. The title in fact refers to the 16th century poet Sir Thomas Wyatt, and I'll be reading his poem "They flee from me that sometime did me seek," and I'll read from that in just a moment. But to give you some basic biographical information on the poet, he was born in Allington Castle in 1503. Allington Castle is located in Maidstone. For anyone that's local to the area, it's a small castle near the Malta Inn on the River Medway by Allington Lock. And from there, Thomas Wyatt grew up, was well educated. He was from a very aristocratic background, and he eventually served in Henry VIII's court. He was a diplomat, a lyric poet, politician, a very learned man, and I'll talk more about his life and his famous son after I've read the poem. They flee from me that sometime did me seek, by Sir Thomas Wyatt. They flee from me that sometime did me seek, with naked foot stalking in my chamber. I have seen them gentle, tame and meek, that now are wild, and do not remember that sometime they put themselves in danger to take bread at my hand, and now they range, busily seeking with a continual change. Thanked be fortune, it hath been otherwise, 20 times better, but once in special, in thin array after a pleasant guise, when her loose gown from her shoulders did fall, and she caught me in her arms long and small. Therewithal sweetly did me kiss, and softly said, "Dear heart, how you like this?" It was no dream, I lay broad waking, but all is turned, thorough my gentleness, into a strange fashion of forsaking, and I have leave to go of her goodness, and she also to use newfangleness. But since that I so kindly am served, I would fain know what she hath deserved. So that's the poem. Probably Thomas Wyatt's most famous poem. I first encountered it when I was studying my English literature A-level, and it was in the Love anthology that we had to study. I can't remember whether it was a EdXL or AQA exam, but that poem was in the anthology that we had to sit an exam on, and that's when I realised he was from Maidstone, studied and realised his involvement with Henry VIII, arguably our most famous king, or England's most famous king. So the poem itself is written in Iambic Pentameter, which essentially means there are 5 beats in every line, usually 10 syllables. There is a rhyme scheme used throughout as well, and of course, it being a poem written in the 16th century, it has much of the diction from that time, words like hath, and the word newfangleness, which is a word I had to look up, originates from Chaucer, who many consider to be the father of the English language, the poet who wrote Canterbury Tales. And newfangleness just means new ideas, new fashions. The poem itself, it could be argued, is about unrequited love, so love that isn't reciprocated from one person to the other. And the tone of the poem is undeniably sad. The poem, in a nutshell, expresses the feeling of somebody who was once sought after, once successful, sexually, emotionally, with the opposite sex, but now they are no longer. And the poem is a reflection on times when they were. The poem explores the idea that things can change, or one's experience of life can change very rapidly, as it has for this speaker. And I'm not 100% sure when it was published, or when it was written, I should say, because all of Thomas Wyatt's poems were published and circulated to a wider audience 15 years after his death, though of course in the court they would have all read each other's poetry. But the poem expresses that loss of intimacy, and it does so in a very psychological yet subtle way. And I think it's a good poem. Like I say, it's very well crafted, the rhythm's good, the imagery's there, it uses some type of cliche or some cliches with regard to the lover maybe being a deer and eating food from his palm and then now shunning him, he's alone. It includes dialogue, there's some strong imagery there, and it's very lamentable. Many have speculated that it's quite an autobiographical poem. Sir Thomas Wyatt was rumoured to have had an affair with Anne Boleyn, one of Henry VIII's wives. He spent time in the Tower of London and escaped execution, though he was on trial for this. His main patron was Thomas Cromwell, and I think it's fair to say that his biggest contribution to English literature was the fact that he's rumoured to be the poet who brought the sonnet from Italy back to England. He was certainly one of the first. And that story goes that Henry VIII wanted an annulment from the Pope so he could remarry. He sent Thomas Wyatt, along with some other diplomats from his court, to Italy to negotiate this deal. As I imagine most of you know, this was unsuccessful, and this led to the breakaway, or the break from the Catholic Church. Henry VIII announced himself as the head of the church, and that's where we get the Church of England from. And although it was a failed mission in that regard, while Wyatt was in Italy, he came across the sonnet poems of Petrarch, and he translated those into English and then wrote his own sonnets in his mother tongue, being English. The sonnet is a very famous form of poetry. It's 14 lines. Petrarch, when writing them, wrote them to a lover, an idealised lover, Stella, I believe her name was, meaning star. And Petrarch's sonnets operate in such a way that the first 8 lines, the octave, present an idea, and the final 6 lines, the sestet, goes against that idea to create some type of resolution at the end. There's a volta in between the 8th and the 9th line that turns the poem. And like I say, Thomas Wyatt translated many of these poems, started writing his own, and then decades later, quite a few decades later, Shakespeare enhanced the form, immortalised it, many would argue, and wrote his sequence of sonnets, and thus the sonnet has been known as the ideal form for love poetry, or the traditional form for love poetry. I should also mention, before finishing the video, that Thomas Wyatt had a famous son, also called Thomas Wyatt. Any of you that may recognise the name may know it because of the son. The son, Thomas Wyatt, led a famous rebellion against Elizabeth I, and this is known as Wyatt's Rebellion. And it's interesting to think that the Thomas Wyatt in question for this video, the poet, served under Henry VIII and served in his court. Thomas Wyatt had a son who rebelled against Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I, arguably the second most famous monarch in English history, the monarch who was in power during our golden years, or the golden age, I should say. So that's the video on Thomas Wyatt. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I say, it's a very famous love poem, "They flee from me that sometime did me seek." I appreciate all the views and all the nice comments people have left me. I believe the next two videos will probably explore certain scenes from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the balcony scene, and some soliloquies of Romeo as well outside that scene. Perhaps Act 3, Scene 1, the fight. But that's a video for another time. Thank you for listening, and all the best as always.